And so I took it to myself, and my partner went to India in 1991 with backpacks. We arrived in New Delhi and stayed at a place that we'd booked. This was before the internet, of course, and it was pretty quiet when we arrived at 3:30 or 4 in the morning. And the book about India, it was an amazing experience, although I do not recommend camel safaris from Jaisalmer. I've only done that once, and I will never get on a camel again. They're actually not nice animals. I don't want to offend anyone here who has a love of camels.
Good day, everyone. My name is Hnbl Anthony from Fiji Times, India Times Australia, and aajKal local and global. Today, here in Parramatta, Riverside Theatre, for the launch of Australia's Pivot to India by Andrew Charlton.
Now, friends, it's now my pleasure to hand over to the Prime Minister. And I'll say, Prime Minister, thank you for everything you have done for the Australia-India relationship. Thank you for giving it your energy and your focus from day one. Friends, please welcome the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese.
I do begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting this evening and pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. With its hundreds of languages, with its people of different faiths, of different backgrounds coming together, all enriched by the diversity of that extraordinary culture. And I'm very pleased, and I thank Andrew for giving me the honour of launching his book. To be fair, he did put me on the cover. But I assure you the inside is even better. And when Andrew came to see me about this, I said, well, I need a copy of the book. I only launch books that I have read and that I read first before I confirm that I will launch them, because you just never know. You just never know. Now, I've known Andrew a long time, so I was pretty confident that this would be a scholarly work, and indeed it is. I have had a long-term fascination with India, in part because of the diaspora here and people I grew up with, but in part also because I think the history of India is just so extraordinary, as Andrew has said. A country, a nation that represented 1/4 of the world's GDP just a few centuries ago. A culture that is so rich and vibrant and so different in so many ways from Australia. And so I took it to myself, and my partner went to India in 1991. With backpacks. We arrived in New Delhi and stayed at a place that we'd booked. This was before the internet, of course. We'd got a little booking at a place at Connaught Place there. And it was pretty quiet when we arrived at 3:30 or 4 in the morning. And the book about India, the guidebook that I'd read also on the way there, the Lonely Planet book, as you did, described India as an attack on the senses. Sight, sound, smell, just an extraordinary... And I thought, not that different at 4 a.m. in the morning. When I went out into the main thoroughfares of Delhi the next morning, we went back to the room after a couple of hours, exhausted, because it was such an extraordinary experience. But I say to people, I can't do it now. If you want to understand India, get on a train. Catch a train with everyone else, get on one of the video buses that we travelled on around there. We even hitched between Agra and Jaipur. And we got a lift with a family who were heading that way. And we paid for the petrol and they entertained us along the way. It was an amazing experience, although I do not recommend camel safaris from Jaisalmer. I've only done that once and I will never get on a camel again. They're actually not nice animals. I don't want to offend anyone here who has a love of camels, but it is true. So I read this book in literally over 2 sittings, and it's a substantial work, but it's well written and it's readable. And what it will do is expand understanding from Australians of India and of our relationship. And it isn't uncritical. It puts in a realistic way, in its historic context, the missed opportunities at various points in time by governments of both persuasions, in part due to history, but in part just due to a failure to seize the opportunity which is there. Australia's pivot to India is a thoughtful, warm and optimistic work that educates us about the past, but it also challenges us about the future. We get an engaging recap of modern India's transformation from an inward-looking, high-tariff economy to one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. We learn the evolution of its foreign policy and its strategic thinking, the move from declared, formalised non-alignment, the global changes that occurred with the collapse of the Soviet Union and with other changes and the impact that that had on global strategic politics. But it then moved, of course, from that position to where it is now, a great nation that just hosted a very successful G20 meeting, a more creative multi-alignment with a greater emphasis on self-reliance as well as sovereignty. And this book also confirms that while India was embarking on this journey, Australia was very much running on a parallel track. Australia was modernising our economy and building new trade relationships. But the truth is not enough with India. We're engaging with our region and we're building a greater network of multilateral relationships. But the truth is, again, not enough with India. Occasionally, governments would discover India with a burst of enthusiasm. But as Andrew writes, there was no central core to the relationship, and that had implications. The affection was broad and it was genuine, but there was little depth. Or as Gareth Evans says, there was no ballast to the relationship. And what that meant was that when tensions arose over issues, there was no way of maintaining continuity and communication. Instead, any disagreement risked a spell in the diplomatic deep freeze of both countries. And so for too long, the bilateral relationship between Australia and India was underdone, underexplored and under-examined. Now, happily, as this book records, that has changed a great deal in recent years. Not only is our bilateral relationship stronger and deeper than it has ever been, I think unquestionably that is the case. Our multilateral engagement has also gone to a new level. We are, in Andrew's words, building a distinctive relationship that goes beyond transactional engagement and circumstantial alignment. That's how you build relationships, not by having just a meeting every few years. But I have now had meetings with Prime Minister Modi, Dr Jaishankar, other senior figures in India. Now I think we're up to something like 8, on 8 occasions. I've visited India twice this year. I will visit again at the beginning of 2024. I think that's just an announcement I made I wasn't supposed to, but there you go. We're doing that, on track. For our bilateral meeting, and for also India next year will of course host the Quad Leaders meeting as well. These relationships are so important. We see it in the revitalised Quad, the cooperation in Exercise Malabar, as well as the work we are doing through the G20 on climate change and food security. But just as importantly as that, and I believe in the longer term even more important, we see it beyond summits and statecraft between leaders. We see it in our people. When I travelled to India in March, I brought certainly the most significant business delegation that has visited not just India, but I think as serious a delegation at least as has visited any country in the world in our history. Leaders in finance, communications, resources, infrastructure, the peak organisations led by the head of the Business Council of Australia. This was a very serious group. And similarly, the dialogue and discussion with the visits of Indian businesses right here in Australia as well has been critical. But we see it as well through our communities. When I was in India in 2018, I launched in Delhi the Australia-India Alumni Association. Now that measures in the hundreds of thousands now and is growing substantially. Those people-to-people links which are there are so important. But it's also in the businesses in Harris Park, in Little India, who are using those people-to-people connections to not just benefit us culturally and certainly benefit us in a culinary capacity as well, it must be said, but benefiting the Australian economy as well. This is win-win. We see it in communities like the one right here, which is why it is appropriate that we've established the driver of Australia-India relations by establishing the facility right here in Parramatta. This, of course, is a diaspora as well, which is driven by aspiration, people who've made Australia their home, as migrants have from across the world, because they want something better for their children and grandchildren. They want to contribute, but they also want to remember and honour and still hold on to their heritage of the place where they were born. As Andrew has said, this is changing the way that Australia functions. Andrew spoke about the cricket names, Singh, Smith, Patel and Jones, and that stood out to me in the book as well. But the other thing is that the great the great cricket contest in the world now really is between Australia and India. The Ashes are still important, but I think the focus has shifted enormously to India. And I know that my friends, Brett Lee and Steve Waugh and others, Pat Cummins, are deeply involved in India and have a passion for visiting India, and having visited that wonderful stadium at Ahmedabad in March, I can certainly see what the attraction is. We see it in students and skilled migrants eager to embrace the opportunities here in Australia as well. And we see it certainly travelling back the other way, as small businesses show the leadership to take risks, invest and build connections there in India. When I was there in March, announcing that Deakin University will be the first foreign tertiary education institution in the world to open a campus in India. And the second is Wollongong University, and there'll be more to come. It is fitting that Andrew dedicates this book to his electorate here in Parramatta and to the Indian diaspora, because our people will be the pivot point. Our people will be the central core that Gareth Evans spoke about needing to cement the relationship of a stronger, deeper and more diversified relationship between Australia and India. They aren't just the ballast, they are the engine, not just securing the relationship, but taking it forward. Andrew, congratulations on this important book, and I can promise you that as a member for Parramatta and as a member of a Labor government focused on deepening Australia's relationship with India and determined to build greater peace, prosperity, security and stability in the Indo-Pacific, you are already helping to write the sequel. It is a great pleasure to launch Australia's pivot to India.
Fiji Times. Be with the times.